Madam President, I think it's safe to say that most Republicans here in the Senate expect that at some point we will be receiving articles of impeachment from the House of Representatives, at which time we will conduct the Senate's business. We will give the President a fair opportunity to be heard, something that was lacking in the House of Representatives. I heard the Democratic leader's suggestion that the reason the House had to sit on this is because if they sent this over to the Senate, that somehow the Senate would dismiss this early or immediately or something along those lines. And I have no idea where that comes from. That's never been the intention here for Republicans in the Senate. Republicans in the Senate know full well that we have a job to do under the Constitution in which we hear the case, hear the arguments, ask questions, consider the possibility of additional evidence being presented, and we've said all along that that's how we intend to treat this. But we want to make sure that it is a fair process, a process that isn't rushed, a process that isn't partisan as it was in the House of Representatives. And we have gone so far as to suggest that the precedent that be used be the Clinton precedent. In other words, the precedent was used during President Clinton's impeachment process back in 1999. At that time, there were 100 votes in the Senate. 100 votes, Republican and Democrat, supported that particular process, which, as I pointed out, allows for both sides to make the arguments, the managers in the House of Representatives to come over and make their case, for the President and his team to have an opportunity to respond to that, and then for senators to propound questions, which it seems to me at least is a fair process. So far, we haven't seen the articles, nor have we seen any cooperation from the Senate Democrats about a process that would do all the things I just mentioned. So the Democratic leader's suggestion that they needed to wait all this time because they have to somehow ensure that Republicans were not going to dismiss this that is just a false argument. And I would argue that the House of Representatives sitting on this and stalling it undermines the very point that they made about why it was so important that they do this. If they rush it, that they not hear some of the witnesses, not subpoena some of the witnesses. Some of the very people that they want the Senate to subpoena and hear from are people that they could have subpoenaed and heard from. And so they have now evidently concluded that while at one time we just had to get this through because this president is such a clear and present danger to the country, we've got to do this fast, we've got to do it with a sense of urgency, now all of a sudden the brakes have been put on, and for no apparent reason other than, I would argue, they see political advantage in doing that. But the fact of the matter is the Senate will hear this at some point if we receive the articles, and we will employ a process, a fair process, that allows both sides to make their arguments and to be heard, and then we will allow the Senate to do its will. And whatever 51 votes in the Senate decide is ultimately how this will be disposed of. But I can tell you, contrary to the assertions of the Democrats, that I believe people across this country are very weary and tired, frankly, in some ways exhausted, from having this thing just drag on. There are so many important issues that we need to deal with. We have a trade agreement that is teed up and ready to go that I hope we can vote on here in the United States Senate that has real relevance to the American people. There are farmers and ranchers in my state of South Dakota and across this country who desperately need to expand and open markets. We've got a depressed ag economy, low commodity prices in both grains and livestock, and we need to create some opportunities for these farmers to get back on their feet and to restore to profitability. And instead of that, we are waiting for the impeachment articles to come here, and assuming that they do, we will spend who knows how long on processing that at a time when there are so many pressing needs that the American people care deeply about. Not to mention the fact that, in November of this year, we have an election, a presidential election, congressional elections, where the people of this country can weigh in, where they can have their voices heard. And that's how we ought to decide the differences that we have in this country. You have a difference with the President of the United States, you have an opportunity to go vote in November of this year. And if you decide you don't like him and you want to vote him out of office, you can do that. But that's where I think the American people believe this ought to be decided, not through a long, drawn-out, protracted process here in Washington, D.C., where a bunch of members of Congress who should be working on important issues like energy and health care and economy and jobs and wages and things like that are bogged down over this impeachment process. And so I believe, Madam President, that the American people are weary, and I think they know that starting in about 3 weeks in Iowa, they're going to start voting. We've got a presidential election that's underway, and it seems to me that people who have views that they want to express can make their voices heard in an election rather than having a long, drawn-out impeachment process, which, as I said earlier, the House of Representatives initiated in such a hurried way that they came up with some pretty weak tea type articles of impeachment and in a rush to try and get it over here. Now they're stalling it and not delivering it, and so Senate's not going to act, obviously, until the House acts and sends those articles over. But when they do, we will ensure that, unlike the way they conducted themselves in the House of Representatives, that it is a fair process that gives an opportunity for the President of the United States, who has been attacked through this process, a chance to respond and to defend himself. Madam President, it's safe to say that pretty much every American has been subjected to annoying and illegal robocalls. Who hasn't picked up the phone to discover it's an automated message telling you that you've won a trip to the Bahamas, which you can secure by passing along your credit card information or asking for important banking information so your account won't be closed. These calls are a major nuisance, and too often they're more than a nuisance. Every day, vulnerable Americans fall prey to ever more sophisticated scammers and have money or their identity stolen. Individuals who fall prey to scammers can spend months or years struggling to get their lives back. Madam President, I've been working on the issue of robocalls for several years now, first as chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee and now as chairman of the Commerce Subcommittee on Communications Technology, Innovation, and the Internet. I worked with Senator Markey to lobby the Federal Communications Commission to create a single comprehensive database of reassigned telephone numbers so that legal callers could avoid contacting people who hadn't signed up for messages. And I've spent a lot of time examining ways to discourage illegal robocalling. While Commerce Committee Chairman, I held a hearing with notorious mass robocaller Adrian Abramovich. His testimony made clear that current penalties for illegal robocallers were not sufficient. Illegal robocallers have been building the cost of fines into their activities, and so far there has been no effective mechanism for criminal prosecution. Based upon Abramovich's testimony and testimony from federal enforcers, I developed the Telephone Robocall Abuse, Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence Act, or what we call the TRACED Act, along with Senator Markey. And at the end of December, the President signed our bill into law. The TRACED Act provides tools to discourage illegal robocalls, protect consumers, and crack down on offenders. As I mentioned earlier, criminal prosecution of illegal robocallers can be difficult. Scammers are frequently based abroad and can quickly shut down shop before authorities can get to them. But I believe we need to make sure there is a credible threat of criminal prosecution and prison for those who use robocalls to prey upon the elderly and other vulnerable Americans. To that end, the TRACED Act convenes a working group with representatives from the Department of Justice, the Federal Communications Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, state attorneys general, and others to identify ways to criminally prosecute illegal robocalling. And in the meantime, it expands the window in which the Federal Communications Commission can pursue scammers and levy fines from 1 year to 4 years. The bill also makes it clear for your cell phone carrier to lawfully block calls that aren't properly authenticated, which will ultimately help stop scammers from getting through to your phone. The TRACED Act also tackles the issue of spoof calls, where scammers make the call appear as if it's coming from a known number. TRACED also addresses the issue of so-called one-ring scams, where international scammers try to get individuals to return their calls so that they can charge them exorbitant fees. And it directs the Federal Communications Commission to convene a working group to address the problem of illegal robocalls being made to hospitals. There are too many stories of hospital telephone lines being flooded with robocalls, disrupting critical lines of communication for hours. Will the TRACED Act completely solve the problem of illegal robocalls? No. But it will go a long way toward making it safe to answer your phone again. And it will help ensure that those who exploit vulnerable individuals face punishment for their actions. I'm grateful to Senator Markey for partnering with me on this legislation. The Washington Post praised the Trace Act as an example of, I quote, good old-fashioned legislating, end quote. And I'm proud of the strong bipartisan support that it received in both houses of Congress. Madam President, I look forward to monitoring the implementation of the Trace Act and to continuing to work to protect Americans from illegal and abusive robocalls. Madam President, I yield the floor.